After America is made on the lands of the Kire-Wurrung, Wurundjeri Woi-wurrung and Bunurong peoples. We pay our respects to elders past and present and acknowledge that sovereignty was never ceded.
We are in a battle for the soul of America.
This is a fraud on the American public.
Hi, I'm Angus Blackman, and this is After America. Joining me today is Australia Institute Director of International and Security Affairs, Dr. Emma Shortis. Dr. Emma, how are you?
I'm all right, Angus. Happy New Year. How are you?
Yeah, not too bad. We did joke about American politics' rude habit of being really active in January, but I mean, I got to confess, I didn't think they'd kidnap a foreign leader and put him and weirdly his wife on trial in New York and then defend an ICE agent who killed a civilian and all the other mess that's going on.
Woe is the word, I think. I mean, American politics does have that very rude habit of being very active in January, as you said. Of course, you know, was it the 5th anniversary of the January 6th insurrection just last week? And yeah, I mean, I didn't have the kidnapping of a foreign leader on my specific bingo card either, but I guess when you put all of these events in the context of the Trump administration more broadly and what we know about Trump, you know, what we talk about all the time, you know, in that sense, like the specifics might be surprising, but the intent and the chaos and the, you know, broader plan to radically reshape not just American society, but America's role in the world, you know, it all fits pretty well, I think, in that broader context.
Yeah. So let's start with Venezuela. What's this all about? Why Maduro? Why now?
Look, I think there are a number of reasons for that. There's not like one, as always with Trump, you know, there's not one specific motivation. I think there are a lot of things going on here. So a lot of, I guess, international relations type analysts are pointing to what Trump is describing, Trump himself is describing as the revival of the Monroe Doctrine, which essentially says that the Western Hemisphere, so like the continents basically of North and South America and surrounds, belong to the United States, and no other great power, no one else, should be allowed to even consider threatening American interests in that region. And so in that sense, you know, the Trump administration's attacks on Venezuela can be seen, I think, as a show of dominance, you know, of making a point about US control and that the United States can do whatever the hell it wants in this region. It can, you know, effectively jettison any even kind of modicum of respect for international norms and international law because this is its sphere of influence. And I think largely like that stands up as a motivation, not necessarily for Trump. Like I don't think Trump thinks things through at that level of strategy. You know, he's driven by instinct, but I think a lot of people in his administration are seeing it that way. And then, you know, I guess what that means if we assume that the United States under Trump wants control of the Western Hemisphere, then the idea is that it leaves the rest of the world to other great powers, i.e. Russia and China. And on the face of it, that kind of works, and parts of the administration have been signaling as much, but I don't think it's that straightforward. You know, we've spoken a lot on the show about the administration's complicated ideological relationship with China. Like there are lots of people in that administration who could not countenance, you know, any even suggestion that China might oppose American dominance and American primacy in any region.
Wherever it is, yeah, right.
Exactly. Yeah, that's exactly right. And then, of course, you know, the Trump administration has a pretty complicated relationship with Russia, where, you know, it appears to be still kind of competing with Russia in terms of territorial influence. You know, there's this incident of the US detaining, I don't know what the word is, a Russian oil tanker. So there's that kind of territorial competition. But of course, ideologically, the United States is now, under Trump, is now largely aligned with Putin's Russia. So that, I think that spheres of influence motivation is a little bit complicated, and we should avoid falling into the trap of thinking simplistically about like competition between great powers, because it's not that straightforward.
Just sticking with Venezuela for a little bit, Trump said the country will be, quote, turning over 30 to 50 million barrels of oil to the United States. That sounds legit.
Yeah, totally cool and normal to effectively kind of invade a sovereign state, kidnap their head of state, and then take all their oil. I mean, again, Trump has said this many times out loud that he thinks this is what the United States should do. He has said many times he thinks this is what the United States should have done in Iraq. So, Trump does what it says on the box. I think that, the deeply concerning thing, not just for Venezuelans, so of course this has significant immediate impacts on Venezuelan stability and security, is that none of this has been thought through. And this isn't unique to Trump, of course, but, the United States will use military action to depose a government, to depose a leader, to enact regime change, and won't have really made a plan beyond that, for securing genuine peace in a region, for ensuring stability. They would just use military power and continue to resort to military power when inevitably things go wrong. And Trump has said that. He said that, if the interim president of Venezuela doesn't do exactly what he wants, then she will face the same fate, if not worse, than Maduro. So
we get to a situation where they're doing the same thing to the Secretary of Agriculture of Venezuela or something. At some point, they think someone's going to do what they want.
Well, I mean, I've stolen this from social media, but one of my colleagues in the States has said, it's entirely possible to imagine a scenario where the Venezuelan opposition leader, who of course was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize, hands that Peace Prize over to Trump in, some ridiculous produced for TV ceremony, and he then installs her as the leader of Venezuela because he decides he likes her. This is the kind of volatility and unpredictability that we are living with, which I think makes it clear that there is no rationale or logic behind what the United States, quote unquote, running Venezuela will actually mean.
Yeah, and there's a prominent political scientist from the United States who we're hoping to have on the show next week, who wrote in a column in the last week or so that international relations scholars like to argue a lot, mostly with themselves, but the one thing that they kind of agree on, particularly post-Afghanistan and Iraq, is that regime change doesn't work. The consequences are complicated, they're hard to predict, and, there's a lot of evidence to suggest that it becomes a bigger mess than and Venezuela is a mess. The economy is cooked. It's a place where people are struggling.
We know that Trump and the Trump administration more broadly doesn't care about the welfare of ordinary Venezuelans. It doesn't care about the welfare of ordinary Americans, let alone Venezuelans. But I think what I would add to that, I think, obviously you're totally right about regime change, especially this kind of regime change not working, is that the nature of this regime change, how it has been done, also makes the rest of the world a much more dangerous place. As much as I don't think it's simplistic as one world leader will see Trump does something and then decide, well, I'm going to do that too. It's not necessarily that straightforward. But this does license other nations, Russia, China, whoever, to do the same thing. Israel, for example, already has total license from the United States to do whatever it wants. But what's to say that, as many people have pointed out, that, for example, the Chinese president wouldn't see this example and decide to do the same thing in Taiwan. Russia has already attempted to do similar things. But what's to stop now an Arab nation from doing the same thing to Netanyahu? What's to stop this kind of chaos and lawlessness? International law, of course, was far from perfect and arguably already badly broken before this. But it still remains true that, these laws and principles were laid down in the aftermath of World War II in order to make the world a safer place. And largely they did. These laws exist for a reason, and the total destruction of them makes the world a much more dangerous place for all of us.
The president has been clear for months now that the United States should be the nation that has Greenland as part of our overall security apparatus. The United States,
but your wife posted that hours after the Venezuela operation. That's why it's newly relevant.
I'll talk with you about it for an hour. I think it's a really important conversation. I just wanted to reset, Jake, by making clear that it has been the formal position of the U.S. government since the beginning of this administration, frankly, going back into the previous Trump administration, that Greenland should be part of the United States. The president has been very clear about that. That is the formal position of the U.S. government.
The Trump administration is clearly not content with Venezuela alone.
Mm-hmm.
They have talked a lot about taking over Greenland. They've talked about Colombia. They've talked about Cuba. They've talked about other places as well. Greenland seems to be top of the list at the moment based on the rhetoric coming out of the administration. How seriously should we be taking this?
Incredibly seriously. I think this is so dangerous. And we are still, we still find ourselves in this situation where, it is hard to believe. It's hard to believe that this isn't all some revolting joke that the Trump administration would actually do this. But I am increasingly of the view that Venezuela, the action in Venezuela was not a test run, but part of an effort inside the administration, particularly by our dear friend Stephen Miller, who you're no doubt going to put his weaselly voice into one of the packages. Sorry about that.
Right, but can you say that military action against Greenland is off the table?
It wouldn't be military action against Greenland. The Greenland has a population of 30,000 people, Jake. The real question is, by what right does Denmark assert control over Greenland? What is the basis of their territorial claim? The United States should have Greenland as part of the United States. There's no need to even think or talk about this in the context that you're asking of a military operation. Nobody's going to fight the United States militarily over the future of Greenland.
But I think what he and those cronies are doing is warming Trump up to the idea of doing this more. They're giving him an easy made-for-TV, Make America Great Again moment, one of the kinds of shows of dominance and strength and machismo that Trump loves, and working him up to doing more of it, to enacting this Monroe Doctrine of total control of the Western Hemisphere. And I suspect, and again, this is my speculation, I don't have specific evidence for this, but I feel like I spent enough time observing these people to understand, I think, their ideological motivations. And I think they saw Venezuela as a relatively straightforward, easy target, and they're warming up to bigger ones. And look, they're being explicit about that. Stephen Miller's going on CNN and saying, what claim does Denmark have to Greenland? It should be the United States. And the administration is considering options for how to do that, one of which is purchasing it, in a kind of neo-colonial Louisiana, Alaska purchase way. But they are also apparently, considering outright force. And I think they have talked about it so much now. They've gone on TV, national television, and talked up how Greenland should be the United States. The language is escalating. And when they do this, they're not just talking to the base, they're talking directly to Trump. That's how Trump's people get to him. They go on TV and they talk back to him. And I think they're maneuvering him into a position where not taking Greenland, not doing it, is going to make them look weak or look like they don't stick to their word or their guns. And, we know Trump hates that. He hates looking weak. So I think they are attempting at least to bake in a kind of inevitability to this. And Europe is at least taking it seriously. They are scrambling to decide what they're going to do if the Trump administration attempts this. And that's where, we're in such uncharted territory, because it's not clear at all to Europeans or to anybody else what the Trump administration is going to do or how they might respond. But they will have to respond.
Yeah. And I note too that, and I admit this is something that I missed in November last year in response to the blowing up of alleged drug boats by the Trump administration off the Venezuelan coast and in the Caribbean. The UK actually stopped sharing some intelligence with the United States because they didn't want to be associated with actions that they believe were illegal.
Yeah.
I think that's pause for thought, particularly in Australia, where security cooperation between our two countries has pretty consistently gone in one direction only.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think there are really big, I always say this, but there are really big questions coming for Australia very quickly, because unfortunately, I think there is this tendency in Australia to dismiss what the US does in Latin America as, a question for the US, that's got nothing to do with us. But I think the calculations change if the Trump administration starts doing that to Europe. And of course, I'm dancing around it, but part of that is racialized, and the tendency of our foreign policy in particular to be deeply racist, to put it bluntly. That's certainly at play here. But those questions are coming, to pretend that Venezuela is going to be isolated to Venezuela, I think just doesn't jar with reality. It doesn't jar with what the Trump administration is telling us every day.
Yeah. And I know you pointed this out last year, but the kind of racial dynamic to US foreign policy was pretty clear in the national security strategy that they released. Can you tell us a little bit about that for people who maybe missed it on the way to the beach over December?
Yeah, stay at the beach. Don't.
Yeah. Oh, God. Sounds lovely. Instead of the apocalyptic 42 degrees outside in Melbourne where we both are.
It does have, the combination of talking about the total collapse of international law and the apocalyptic bushfire conditions in Victoria really is something else, isn't it?
Like, for what it's worth, this week, for me personally, I'm just a person, but it has been a real penny drop moment in terms of the idea that this is how it is now. Like, we talk about this a lot, and, I listen to, you talk about these issues plenty, but for me, the combination of Venezuela, the talk about Greenland, the stuff in Minneapolis, literally the weather in Australia right now, it is like, oh, no, this is any pretense that I did have about, that maybe this will, we'll go back. I think that's done.
Yeah. I find that too, Angus. There's a difference between kind of observing and analysing intellectually what is happening in the United States and what it is doing. But sometimes it does really just punch you in the face that this is really happening. Like, it isn't some cruel joke that, while these people are embarrassing and often fumbling and, shallow and sometimes predictable, they are also incredibly dangerous. And I think one of those realizations for me has been that they clearly now are convinced that they're invincible, that they can do what they want, or they're warming up to doing absolutely whatever they want. The president said in an interview in the New York Times just overnight, I think, that he's not constrained by anything. He's not constrained by international law. The only thing he's constrained by is his own morality. What a terrifying thought.
Yeah. And for Australia, a country whose foreign policy centers on upholding and strengthening international law as a way of protecting ourselves and our neighbors, the idea that we have shared values with someone who says he does not need international law is those two things can't be true at the same time, right?
No, they're irreconcilable. And there's a reason that the shared values crowd has been fairly quiet, over the last few weeks. And I don't think that's just about it being
it's a tough carry.
It's a really tough carry. I think it's impossible to carry. And again, we've talked about this so much, but, I think it's very clear where public sentiment is going on this issue in terms of how Australians feel about the United States. I keep going back to these stats about how Australians feel about travelling to the United States. So, we did some polling here at the Australia Institute that found that over half of Australians would feel unsafe travelling to the United States. And that's borne out as well by the actual numbers of people, Australians travelling to the United States. So in kind of quote unquote normal times, something like 100,000 Australians travel to the United States every month for, tourism, for business, for whatever. That number has halved. And I think that's a really clear indication of where the Australian public are at on our relationship with the United States. And I think, I can only see that going one way, at least in the immediate future, as Trump continues to be Trump and the Trump administration continues to do what it says it's going to do. And it is beyond me how the Australian government thinks it's going to be able to reconcile those two things, and how that selfie that the Prime Minister took with Trump is just going to follow him around. Yeah. And I just, still it seems like the Australian government is not willing to face the reality that we find ourselves in. And clearly that's hard. The Europeans are struggling with that. The UK is struggling with that. US allies are struggling with that all over the world. But this reluctance to look at the United States with clear eyes, I think, is just becoming increasingly untenable.
Yeah. And I mean, for example, the killing of a protester in Minneapolis by an ICE agent, the administration came out saying that this was an act of domestic terrorism. And I mean, there are plenty of videos out there that the bit that I saw appears to show nothing of the sort. Well, this is meant to be a mini episode, and that's challenging with the amount of stuff that's going on in the United States, but we might leave it there. We are going to be back next week at a slightly funny time, probably Wednesday or Thursday. Emma has rudely decided to move house. How dare she?
Don't recommend.
No, particularly when it's 42 degrees outside. But we'll be back with a guest we've had on before, Professor Elizabeth Saunders from Columbia University, and we'll talk about what's happened in Minneapolis and elsewhere, and Trump's use of, I guess, executive power domestically and abroad. Before we end, I did notice this story in the last week or so, and that is around a global minimum tax agreement. There was a negotiation to agree with, I think about 150 countries agreed that there'd be a global minimum company tax of 15%. The US has become exempt. Scott Bessent, the US Treasury Secretary, called the deal a historic victory in preserving US sovereignty and protecting American workers and businesses from extraterritorial overreach. Irony in me is dead. What a joke.
Yeah. Hate to see extraterritorial overreach.
Yes, and breaches of sovereignty of another country. Incredible stuff. All right, Emma, we'll be back next week. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you. See you then.
Thanks so much for joining us back on After America. This episode was recorded on Friday, the 9th of January, 2026. The latest book from Australia Institute Press, Time for Bravery, What Happens When Australia Chooses Courage, is out now. You can save $5 off using the code POD5, that's POD5. The discount is available for a limited time only. We'd love to hear your thoughts on the show. You can reach us via our email address, podcasts@australiainstitute.org.au. We really do read them. I read them. After America is supported by the Andrew Farron Foundation. We'll be back next week. I'm Angus Blackman. Thanks for listening.